Hello, everyone. This is North Hempstead Town Supervisor Judi Bosworth, and I wanted to thank you for joining us for this important panel discussion that we're hosting as part of the town's celebration for Black History Month. This month honors the significant role that African Americans have made in shaping our history and our future. Today's discussion will focus on the 2021 Black History Month theme, Black Family, Representation, Identity, and Diversity. We will have distinguished panelists who will speak about these topics in depth. The town of North Hempstead is committed to honoring the legacy and contributions of African Americans. We're exceedingly fortunate for these trailblazers who came before us. I'd now like to introduce Council Member Viviana Russell, who will be moderating tonight's panel with our distinguished guests.
What, in your own words, would you consider the Black identity? And another part to that question is, how has the African diaspora affected identity of the Black family?
Difficult question. So I think, it's hard to describe the Black identity because it's just so diverse. And I think, just at the fundamental level, it's just being a Black person and how you interact with society and how you are raised. Speaking to the diversity of the Black identity, obviously we have, being Black is not monolithic. So you can be, of the African diaspora and you can be Afro-Caribbean or Latino Caribbean or African-American from the South. And, for me, and I think, it goes to every single individual of how they form their own identity, and collectively, like, that makes us diverse. For me, my family is from the South. They're descendants of slaves, and my Black identity may be very different than someone whose family came from the Caribbean. So I think it's just a diverse, beautiful identity, beautiful culture. But if you ask any Black person what their identity is and what being Black means, I think you'll get a different answer.
All right. So we just have a little bit of statistics. 74% of Black adults say race is central to their identity, compared to 15% of white adults. Hispanics is 59% and Asians 56%. So in answering that question, how do you think that plays into how the Black family identifies as being Black?
I concur with Martha that there isn't a Black identity, but I do think that the reason why Black people are so aware of the socially constructed race that we are associated with is because our society is so racialized. And that racialization, because it's done by the dominant group, they don't have a race. They as far as they're concerned, they don't really have a race because they're just the norm or whatever. And so it's very, it's not something that we can escape. It impacts every aspect of our life. So I would say that part of the Black identity needs to be an embrace of what it means to be a human being in a racialized society. And so it's, so some people try to escape, they run away from, it's like, well, don't call me Black or whatever, so I think that the positive response is to embrace the reality of being in a racialized society, but not to let that define you in total. So you can have a variety of aspects of who you are, of your culture, of whatever you are interested in. and wish to have as part of your life. But I think it is I think it is a negative thing and a harmful thing to your own identity and your own psyche if you pretend that we are not part of this racialized environment, and that we, some part of our existence should be about dismantling that. So if there's something that's a common denominator, if you will, I would say that it should be the collective desire to dismantle the socially constructed race and all of its power. And you do that not by pretending it doesn't exist. You do that by embracing that it exists, and then working at the at the actions and the policies and the narratives and the art and the everything that is affirms who we are, that really challenges anything that is that puts us down or that puts us in a box, challenges that.
That's a very good point you make. So, as a Black person, as a person that comes from a Cuban background, mother who was born and raised here in the United States, being Black does not just mean one thing. I can be Afro-Cuban, African-American. There's so many different things that encompass the Black identity that it's really difficult to say that the Black identity is one particular thing. Marv and Erica, do you have any thoughts or comments?
I mean, I concur with everything that Elaine said, because what I was thinking is how you show up. So when I walk out my door, I'm automatically identified as Black, whereas other cultures, like that's the first thing that, like how people see you. And I agree that that's part of like what does need to be dismantled, because I'm more than obviously just my race. But yeah, I've seen other examples where people don't want to identify as Black, or people don't want to be called African American because they don't like the connotation that it gives off. So they may identify themselves as based on their island of origin or some other way, just to not be associated with either of those terms, because it has come to have some sort of negative connotation for some folks, and makes them uncomfortable. So to me, I'm more than Black is something that I have to identify with on a survey, but it's not all of who I am. My identity goes beyond being Black. And I mean, I'm proud that I'm Black, but again, I'm Black, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a young person. Like Elaine said, there are other qualities that are part of my identity, and those should be presented just as high, if not higher, than the fact that I'm of what the color of my skin is.
Absolutely. And to add to that, like, as Elaine said, that being Black impacts every part of our lives and how we interact with society. And I'm not surprised that, those stats that, Black folks identify, being Black and that identity in such a high esteem, because, what, a racist society gave to us became our biggest strength. When a government robbed us of, all rights and all dignity, we turned to the Black family, we turned to the Black church to lift ourselves up. When, they robbed us of food or, just economic opportunity, within the Black community, within our Black identity, we found ways to be resilient and make it past. And continue to, show up and try our best every day. So though, all negative impacts and negative stereotypes of being Black are thrown at us, we make lemons from lemonade or lemonade from lemons, and, use that to our strength and help each other out. And despite everything that we've been thrown against us, we continue to try to push forward and have the optimism and honestly be the representation of the American spirit.
Well, one of the things that was raised during the whole census count is very interesting in terms of how people identify themselves. And of course, the critical issue there that upsets so many people, particularly the new arrivals, is that, to what extent, in terms of identification, your immigrants, are going to be counted. Because usually when you do a census, it has nothing to do with necessarily you being a citizen. It has more or less who you are here in this country, a person. So we get back to terms of our identity, and of course that's shifted over the years from in terms of nomenclature. It goes all the way back to the very beginning where African was pretty prominent. But you particularly through the church group. Church was calling them the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion, or what have you. They had an African designation up front. So many people in our community began to identify themselves as African. However, then as time goes by, and you can look at it from an organizational perspective, is that some of the terminology, some of the nomenclature and identity markers change. If you look at Marcus Garvey, for example, had the UNIA, the Negro Improvement Association, as the Negro designation. When the NAACP comes along a few years later, it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And of course, that continues to be a part of their title of the NAACP. Then, of course, with the 60s, as a matter of fact, there was a whole struggle even to capitalize Negro at one point, because it was a lower case. There was a whole struggle that was launched there to capitalize Negro. So that was pretty much the commanding designation. The majority of people identified themselves as Negro. No matter what period of time you go through, it has a political implication. Our identity, how we called ourselves, always had a determining factor in terms of where we stood politically in the society. As we struggled for full citizenship, that was one issue. Whether we wanted to be identified as a nation, that was another thing. As African Americans, that came into play. The Black Americans, the 1960s really was like a dramatic change, almost like a climate change when it comes to identification, because with the whole movement, again, it's the politics, the political movement out there, we began to identify ourselves as Black. And of course, the Black Arts Movement, Black Pride, Black Power, all of those things were determining factors in terms of how we identified ourselves. And that contrasted, in terms of the whole cultural matrix, because there was a push in this country for the multicultural situation to begin to minimize, our particular role in a racial context. Because you threw us into a bag with a number of other, ethnic groups. So there was a fight against that, because we wanted a separate identity. So that's where African American and Black Americans gained prominence. And it continues today, I think. Maybe the panelists can help me with this in terms of how people begin to see themselves in which nomenclature, which one of those designations is the most popular. It's kind of a nip and tuck, kind of an interchange that go on between, and there's no difference between calling yourself an African or Afro-American or Black American.
So part of the Black identity, I would say for our younger people, is that they don't see that representation in the places that they are, whether it's in community, in leadership roles, in school. And so only a few states require public schools to teach Black history. That includes Florida, Illinois, and as of 2002, New Jersey. Most of these states don't define what should be included in the Black History Plan. Can you identify what is being taught in our schools about Black American history, as well as the African diaspora? if any?
Well, I can tell you what we've learned from high school students from Long Island and some of the educators that work with us. They're not being taught the real history of America. So I wouldn't necessarily call it Black history. I would say the real history. So what the students tell us is they learned that Levittown was one of the first suburbs, for example. But they don't, the whole part about racial covenants in the deeds, that the federal government was responsible for that, they don't get that. So as a result, they don't have the ability to say, oh, wait a minute, the federal government made tremendous investment in white people and helping them to be able to own homes when before the FHA was set up, people had to pay cash for a home, or they paid 50% down and then had to pay the rest off in 15 years. The whole mechanism, which we continue to do now, you put a little bit down and then you pay it off what seems like your life. That allows working people to be able to purchase a home. So a wonderful invention, but only the white veterans could take advantage of that. Black veterans could not.
Right.
And the idea with the racial covenants and the deeds was that in perpetuity, we wouldn't be able to take advantage. So that was a tremendous investment. And all of that has appreciated, of course. If you purchased a home in Levittown, now that home, maybe you purchased it for, I don't know, 30,000 or maybe even less than that. Now it's 400,000 or 500,000.
Mm-hmm.
So you, the individual white person, are able to benefit from all of that appreciation, whereas Black people were shut out of that. And so I say it's the real history that would include all of the ways in which structural racism has benefited whites and disadvantaged Blacks. That's what is not taught. So the narrative is one that says, well, if you were an immigrant, a white immigrant, you talk about how, oh, my family members worked so hard, they came here with nothing, and but they forgot, the investment that the federal government made that allowed you to have your home appreciate. The federal government gave away land. Of course, it wasn't their land to give; it was Native American land. But they gave away land to the immigrants, the white immigrants that came, and they couldn't deal with what are we going to do with the former individuals who were enslaved. That was, there was that little period during Reconstruction where supposedly we were going to get some land and whatever, but that was like an angst. And of course, as we know, they really did, the Reconstruction really didn't do what it was supposed to do and took back a lot that supposedly they were giving. But they didn't have any problem with the land grants for the white immigrants who hadn't even been here. Black people had been building the country. But the new immigrants came and they gave them land grants to move west. And as I say, land that wasn't theirs to give. But they couldn't manage to do anything, for the people who had built the economy, who had built the wealth for the country on their backs.
So for full disclosure, Mr. Boyd was my Black history professor.
There you go. Hey, she still owes me a paper. Oh, no, we won't go into that.
That is not true, but go ahead.
Yeah, she was an excellent student, as you are an excellent moderator here. I think we need African American Black history courses more so than ever. It's really so absolutely necessary today. You have to understand that as a people and the deprivation that we have endured on so many fronts, and particularly on the educational front, because without that solid background, there's only three ways you can do it, V. As far as I'm concerned, is the family. It starts in the family. If the family is together, solid, the old kitchen table, boom, 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 where you can begin to get those first lessons in terms of education. Then, of course, it's the school system. If the school system is bereft and denies you, then again, you're in a very negative disposition. Then, of course, is that what can you pick up on your own from your comrades, your peers there, the kind of whole self-education. Well, that's the other aspect. Very few of us have that kind of talent and skill in terms of self-educating, the whole so-called didactic, to teach yourself. Very few of us have that possibility. So you have to depend on the education system. And if that's denying you and negating you, then you have to struggle. That's what Black Studies was all about, was trying to get inclusion, make sure we had an opportunity to discuss our own history and culture because it was not in the textbook. We were looking at the teachers, we were not the teachers. So we had so many handicaps in terms of getting a full understanding of who we are as a people. That's a struggle that continues. And each period we found different kind of roadblocks and obstacles to keep us from getting a full identification, a full education, a full access to society. That's an ongoing struggle because of systemic racism, because there's one, what you call enduring problem in this country, and that's systemic racism. In the very beginning, it was there and it continues to manifest itself in so many different ways. And it provides these roadblocks, these obstacles, which you have to continually hurdle in order to gain stuff that we thought, well, it should be automatically given to us as citizens in this country. But we know that our struggle has always been triple jeopardy.
And so
Absolutely.
on something that I'm going to get to. Go ahead, Marv, and I want to come back to something that you said, Mr. Boyd.
Sure. I think in regards to the Black experience being taught in American history, the way that I think it's learned, that we learn, some key names, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Rosa Parks, MLK, and then miraculously we get Obama. And I think that's very harmful to Black youth for them to not understand the context of the environment that they're in. They can, grow up in poverty, but not really understand like what got them there. And therefore it's hard to overcome and be prepared to tear down those boundaries. I think we're also talking here about, representation in the classroom, right? Like for me, I grew up in Long Beach, and, in my core subjects, I only had one Black teacher, K through 12. And so we know statistically, when there's a Black educator in the classroom, Black students will do well, will do better, but also white students as well. And I think the risk of it all, I think we've seen in the insurrection in the Capitol this year, like that Confederate flag walking through the halls of Congress is a result of that white student not knowing the experience of Black folks and people of color in this country. And, the United States Department of Homeland Security identified, domestic terrorism and white supremacy specifically as a threat to our democracy and to our safety. I think there are repercussions both for Black youth and being able to understand their own identity and how to succeed and prosper in the country, but it's a direct threat to our way of life and our democracy for white students to not learn it as well.
Erica, would you like to add something?
No, I mean, I think they've pretty much they've covered everything. I mean, I think it is definitely important, and I also think the lack of it, if it's not supplemented at home, is why there's, I was a product of it, a surge of folks going to like historically Black colleges and universities to be able to be taught by other people that are giving you other context. But at that point, you're in college. This is something that should have been made available well before then in the education system. And like Elaine said, it's a part of the history. So I shouldn't be learning later on in life that, you know, the end product that somebody tells me about a light, that the filament inside the light was developed by a Black person, right? Like, you only told me who made the light. You know, like, there are so many just little nuggets that were supplemented by other activities that I was involved in, but that was left out of the in-school history that I was being taught.
Yeah, and it's like I don't think that we are in disagreement. I'm making the point that if you're teaching American history, if that's one of the subjects, American history includes a lot of stuff that is not being taught now that has to do with Black people. And so it should not be thought of as this sort of add-on that, you know, well, maybe we'll, you know, it's extra. It's central to the history.
Basic.
So that history needs to be taught. But in addition, there's a lot to be done to go deeper. There's the literature written by Black people. There's, you know, I mean, you could just go on and on. So there's plenty of material to deepen one's understanding of all that is, you know, that is available to us from Black people and about Black people. But I also don't want to let K through 12 off the hook,
right? In
terms of thinking that the American history that they're teaching is the true American history. It's not.
Right.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, without Black Americans, it wouldn't be America as we know it, you know, and I think particularly economically, you know, it's no mistake that we're the most powerful economic country that ever existed. You know, without free Black slaves, you know, building this country quite literally for free, you know, we wouldn't have the power and economy that we do right now.
Right. So a quick story: when my oldest son was in, I think, the 3rd grade, they were talking about Christopher Columbus. And, you know, you spoke about teaching at home. And so we teach our children at home because we know from our own experiences that these things are not taught in school. So if you don't do the teaching at home, your children are just not going to get the information. And so we had bought him a book, and I believe the name of the book was What They Don't Teach You in School About Black People or Black History or something like that. And actually, I think it was a something that was referred to me by you, Mr. Boyd, when I was in college, but my son was very young. He took that book to school and the book never came back home. And it was very interesting that happened. And, you know, of course, there was, you know, some discussions with the school and what have you. The book never turned up. And my son blatantly told me that the teacher took the book away from him and told him that book was all lies. So I say all that to say that, you know, if we don't teach at home or make some changes in the education system, these things will continue to happen. My son is now 30, and now history is not being taught the way that it should be taught. Still, it's still not being taught the way that it should be taught. Why do you think that my son's book was taken away? Why do you think that Blacks are excluded from American history, except for the fact that they perpetuate the story that Black history started with slavery, and we had no existence prior to slavery? Why do you think that is?
I think quite simply, knowledge is power. You know, I think, you know, the slave master knew that. That's why they didn't allow slaves to read. You know, if knowledge is bestowed to, you know, not only Black students, but all students, they'll be able to have the wisdom to overcome some barriers. And I think that there's some interest the status quo from, white folks, quite frankly, a lot of the time. So they don't want that sort of knowledge to be given to a community because they want to protect their own interests. So simply stated, knowledge is power, and they don't want certain facts to be known for their interests.
I think the reason why we have what has come out during the it's almost Wednesday the 20th, so I'll say the previous administration. There were a lot of things trying to control the narrative, and saying that you couldn't use federal funds on programs that were teaching about anti-racism and things of that nature. The reason for that is that whoever controls the narrative is creating the history, has the power. And so to challenge that, I mean, that's why people were becoming apoplectic about Black Lives Matter. It's like, what do you mean? What do you mean Black Lives Matter? This is a white country. I even heard, I was reading something just in the papers talking about that Black people were telling a story that was not true about the country. It was against our democracy, and it's just completely twisted around.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why there's such a, the reason why your son's book was taken was because it was challenging in a fundamental way the narrative that, either we have a very limited purpose or we're invisible, so we have no role. And that's why they took the book.
Mr. Wood?
It was a news report just the other day. I think it was a family in New Rochelle, and they had a Black Lives Matter sign on their lawn, and somebody came along and defaced it and put white, over the black.
Mm.
I say, okay, let's keep that sign there, but let's take lives and strike the V out of there. And you can see white lives matter, because they have certainly considerably mattered over the last recent history. The whole situation in the insurrection at the Capitol Hill, I always called it Bunker Hill, the whole uprising there it was all fomented by lies. So we have to fight, not only to tell our story, get the accuracy and the truth in this society, but you're fighting this whole backlog of lies that have been perpetrated over the years. And you talk about the book being taken away. It was a teacher here in the New York school system. I think it was up in the Bronx. A student wanted to discuss Malcolm X. And the teacher said, no, we don't need to talk about him because he was all about violence. So that's a misapprehension, a misunderstanding of what Malcolm was all about. In effect, what I'm saying, gang, is that the teachers have to be taught. So many of those teachers came through and didn't get an opportunity to get the kind of full warp and woof of what we understood as activists in the street. We learned from the Dr. John Henry Clarks and the Dr. Benz and the Dr. Jeffries. We had our Carterwoods and our Du Bois. We knew about Baldwin, Toni Morrison. We had all those kind of things that we inculcated on our own, because if we waited for graduate school, because when I was going through on the graduate level, we had to create Black studies. It was not, this is 1960s we talk about, not ancient history. In the 1960s, we still had to struggle to make, I was in a history department where the head of the department had no understanding who Du Bois was. I say, I'm in trouble. I knew I was in trouble right then, because in other words, I'm going to have to teach him something. So I'm still an undergraduate when I'm at Wayne State University, when we began to empower ourselves. Largely that stemmed from a political situation. Detroit had a revolution, an uprising, an insurrection, you might say, in 1967. That very dramatically changed things. The whole tenor of things was changed across the full spectrum of that city and largely across the country, because after the assassination of Dr. King, we had these eruptions in major cities and even smaller towns, people very upset with that. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence of that, in order to offer some kind of remedy to rectify things, you had a number of academies that began to open their doors up, because it was so fearful that the outbreak, the outrage would reach their doors. So they began to allow the activists on the communities and the various institutions to begin to establish their own curriculum. That's how I got started, because we forced ourselves into the classroom. We took control of those classrooms. It was at Cornell, it was at Harvard and Yale. It happened in the Howard University, University of Chicago, Berkeley in California. Across this country, we had to take control of our education because it was not being dispensed to us in an accurate way, or in fact, not at all. We weren't getting anything at all about Black culture. I mean, you talk about the light situation, Elaine. Hey, man, it was Edison, not Lewis Latimer, right? We had to teach him who Lewis Latimer was. We had to tell him who Daniel Hale Williams was. You know, essentially it was brought to discussion. We'll probably get to this discussion a little later on, V, in terms of we were brought here ostensibly to work, to mine, to labor without any kind of compensation. That was our beginning. A byproduct of that was our cultural ambitions, dreams, and abilities. They found a way to kind of capture that too. I was just looking at the death of Phil Spector, the wall of sound, you know, how he got to be so powerful in the industry, the music industry. He capitalized off of Black talent. You look at all those people. I mean, Darlene Love. I mean, it was an outstanding vocalist. He had her under control. Not to say that Berry Gordy didn't do the same thing, capitalizing off of all that talent around him in Detroit and elsewhere. But that was a byproduct of the labor, because we all essentially was brought to this country to do the farming, the mining, the building, the whole construction of this country, blood, sweat, and tears. That was our beginning. But then they got something extra when one of the field hands started singing, say, oh, we can capture and use that too. That's been our history. And that's what we have to take control over and gain power. We talk about power, Elaine, we got to control these industries that have captured the genius, the Black genius that have been captured and then expropriated, and they've profited from it. So that's the struggle we have, is to gain control of what our resources, it's in our community.
This has been some really dynamic conversation with a lot of meat to it. So in that vein of talking about teaching and how it's important that history does not exclude the Black experience or Black people from its history, and talking about our youth, how having that knowledge would be impactful, but also powerful for their socialization, for their esteem, for their desires, their dreams, their goals. So on the heels of what has taken place over this last year, over the last several years, the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement, what did it feel like for you to see the younger generation more actively involved in mobilizing in a quest to see change and openly identifying themselves now as being Black. Aside from it not being taught in the schools, aside from society portraying one image or a negative image of Black people, you now see young people leading the charge in the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you think about that? Do you think it's given them a greater sense of self-worth and determination?
Absolutely.
Do you think it's just a fad? You know, what are your thoughts on that?
I find it to be the most empowering and inspiring thing, and I think it does really lead to us having as young people the onus be on us to make this moment into a movement. For example, it was 2015 or 2014 when the Black Lives Matter movement really blossomed, and I was in college. Then I was at Northeastern University when Trayvon Martin was killed, and actively took to the streets in Boston, and my sister did as well. And it was that experience and learning, understanding, and seeing that community that really mobilized me to take my political and government career to the next level. So if it weren't for me being mobilized during that time, I would have never been a director of policy for Nassau County or director of community development for the city of Long Beach. I think it really gives you some insight, being a part of that collective movement of what the power, what your power actually is, and obviously what the community is organizing you towards. And I think that's why you see now, even Gen Z, and I think that obviously I'm a millennial, I think that they thought we had it going on, but Gen Z is really outperforming us in regards to boycotting, different companies to change their policy. You see, companies, putting out Black Lives Matter statements left and right over the past years. And that's, them not only using their political power, but their financial collective power to influence change at all levels of our society, or at least try to. But I think, again, just as, the civil rights movement produced a generation of leadership, that we're experiencing the same sort of thing. And hopefully they don't gun us down like they did that time. But I think we're entering government, entering public service, entering the financial sector, being Black first, and being held account to our community.
I also find it very inspiring. I mean, from participating in protests in my own community of Baldwin to actually going to the March on Washington, it felt surreal because that was something I learned in history, to actually be part of it. But I think it was awesome that it was being led by people younger than me, people younger than me that are leading the chants. And it really shows that there is some legacy being created. And while there's not formal succession plans, to me, it gave me hope for the future.
Yeah.
So not being a young person, it's very exciting to see the young people in leadership, and to see the young people who are on the call today. So it's all good.
Right. And I think a key part of this Black Lives Matter movement, borrowing from our forefathers and foresisters in the movement, right? I think you saw a lot of citation of, the civil rights movement, and that clear connection between what my generation is experiencing and it being connected to what the Black experience has been thus far. So I think that though it's not a formal handing of the torch, I think we have, this sort of communication and this conversation between generations that I think is so important, so that thought, that movement, that tradition is not lost. So I think it's been super exciting for me, and to learn, use essentially the same tactics that were used 50 years ago. We added a little bit technology to it, and we're back on the streets again.
Love it.
I often make that point, Marvin, talking to a lot of the young activists that, hey, once upon a time, I was out there just like you. But what has to happen is that BLM, Black Lives Matter, has to hook up with BLM, the Black Liberation Movement. We got to bring those two things together. And that's essentially what you're talking about, Marvin, in terms of this intergenerational dialogue. And even as we speak here, it's good to have the nice gender balance. I'm always interested in gender balance, but I'm also interested in kind of generational balance too. That we have some of the elders, particularly the veterans of the struggle, they have so much information. We still have not had, as far as I'm concerned, a definitive analysis of what happened with the 60s. What are the strengths and the weaknesses of it? We had a number of scholars who dealt with it in a number of ways and saying that, what happened there was like the kind of a dichotomy, the eruption or the destruction in terms of like people taking different ideological positions kind of undermine the overall push. But that's always been a part of our struggle. We've had differing views, differing opinions out there, if in terms of going all the way back to Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, with Dr. King and Malcolm, there were differences there, right into this here current struggle, current period of revolutionary struggle. You have differences out there. At the same time, having some kind of dialogue out there that's constructive, particularly intergenerational, just has to be done. I mean, they can't feel that they're alone, and the elders have to step up too. They can't just stand by and let them go. Hey, we got some information. Here's what we did. Here's a tactic that we use. Here's a strategy that was useful for us. And have this dialogue, so they can like be better informed about and not make some of the same mistakes that we made in our generation.